At LinkedIn, we know hiring is a big deal for your small business. Sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming. LinkedIn uses data that you can't find anywhere else to give you the best candidates, all so you can feel confident you're hiring the best person for the job. And even a little hiring bliss. See why 86% of small businesses who post a job on LinkedIn get a qualified candidate within a day. Post a job for free at linkedin.com/achieve. LinkedIn, your next great hire is here.
You're listening to What She Said with me, Candace Sampson, and this is your weekly reminder to take up big space in life, laugh loudly, absorb new knowledge, and continue to grow and expand. What She Said is your space for the big conversations that matter and the little joys that make life sweeter. This is where empowerment meets self-care and mansplaining has no seat at the table. So grab a coffee, get comfy, and let's jump into it because life's too short not to embrace the good stuff while we tackle the tough stuff.
And one girl who the group leader said was probably around 12 years old said, "Yeah, I know. Sometimes they fight with you and sometimes they kill you." And it just chilled me in that moment. Mm-hmm. I've never forgotten it. As I started to write the book, I thought, that's what I want to lead with. You know, I want it to be dramatic. I want it to draw people's attention to the cover of the book because I want them to read it. But I don't think it's a sensationalistic title because it's the truth.
That's Pamela Cross. Pamela is a feminist lawyer and one of Canada's foremost experts on violence against women and the law. She spent decades fighting for justice, first in the courtroom and now by pushing for systemic change that actually protects women. In this conversation, we talk about her new book, And Sometimes They Kill You, a blunt but painfully accurate title that reflects the terrifying reality of intimate partner violence in this country. Pamela shares how a single encounter with a young mother fleeing violence has shaped her entire career, how the law continues to enable abusers, and what changes are urgently needed. This episode is a must-listen for anyone who wants to understand the depth of this crisis and how we can all be part of the solution. Let's hear what she said. Pam, I am really looking forward to discussing this book with you, not because of the subject matter, but because it's really important to shine a light on this subject. So you write in the preface of the book about how a chance encounter with a young mother fleeing intimate partner violence shaped your career. Can you share how that moment influenced your path and how it connects to the work you do today?
I can indeed. I went to law school when I was 35. So I'd had a full life before I started law school. And I went there because of my political activism and because I wanted to find ways to use the law to be helpful to people when I saw so often the ways in which it wasn't. And in fact, in ways it was going to be harmful to people. But I didn't have a concrete idea of what that would look like while I was a law student. I set up a practice after I completed all of the requirements to become a lawyer. And literally on the first day that my office was opened, a young woman came in carrying a baby saying, "I've left my husband at home with our son. He has a gun." So that really immediately catapulted me in a very dramatic way into the work of violence against women and the law. I took her on as a client. I think I learned more from her than I was able to offer her. I mean, remember, my first day of work, I didn't have any clients. She was my very first one. And I became so engaged with how critical this issue is for so many women that I just never left that work. I practiced law for a number of years. My clients were all women dealing with gender-based violence of one kind or another, mostly intimate partner violence, but also women who were survivors of sexual assault, sexual harassment. I worked largely in the area of family law, but really I provided whatever legal services and supports they needed. So I was also involved with child protection law and with criminal law. And after doing that work for about 5 years, I thought, boy, I could be doing this till I'm 500 years old, and it wouldn't change. I can help individual women but the system of the law is so flawed. I need to find a different way to do my work. From the day that woman walked into my office in 1995 until the late 1990s, I was working on the individual level. And then I shifted the focus of my work to do system change work. And that's what I've done ever since. It's involved a wide range of activities, from research to training to resource development for survivors of gender-based violence, training for the frontline workers who support them. And then a lot of my work has been focused on law reform advocacy. And really, I owe it all to that woman who came running into my office.
Before we go into the book, though, I'm actually intrigued about this sort of path from activism into law. That's not a common path, I don't think, for most people who would be going into law. How did your experience in activism help you in law?
Oh, it was extremely helpful, I have to say. When I was a kid, I had always been interested in the law. I'm not really sure where that interest came from. Sitting with my parents watching Perry Mason, maybe, in a very unrealistic look at how the law works. But I certainly had been interested in the idea of law. As a teenager, I became engaged with political issues, and in a very, what would I call it, really sort of exploratory way. I was a kid. I was a white kid from a middle-class suburb. I didn't really know a lot about the more difficult side of life, that's for sure. And then my life, went down a path that didn't include going to law school. But through my 20s and into my 30s, I became more and more involved in political activism. And that activism included being involved in civil disobedience campaigns, which inevitably led to my being arrested, criminally charged, found guilty, going to jail for short periods of time, and so on. And that really reignited my interest in the law, because it struck me that this was a pretty foolish use of resources to round up people who were sitting in a street or blockading a building, expending money on prosecuting us, and so on. But those short little stints in jail also let me see people who were in jail who didn't have any of the privilege that I or my colleagues had. Largely women, often women of color, who were caught for small crimes, sometimes caught for being in Canada illegally. And I saw the ways in which the law completely disrupted their lives and how violent that law was to them. So I started thinking again about the idea of the law and decided I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to find a way to see if the law could work as a tool for social change rather than as a weapon of oppression. That's what led me into law school. I didn't have a clearly focused idea of what I was going to do as a lawyer at the end of that time. I knew I was interested in issues relating to women. Much of my activism had been related to things like access to abortion, criminalization of women, and so on. While I was at law school, I saw very quickly the ways in which, despite Canada having a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, despite the federal government loving to talk about how women in Canada had equality with men, that really just wasn't true, that women weren't treated equally in front of the law in many, many ways. And so I think, in a way, I knew I was going to end up doing something related to women. But until that woman came into my office, I wasn't sure exactly what that would look like. I was unlike most of my fellow students. I started law school with a criminal record. I continued to expand my criminal record while I was at law school. I was actually in jail on the first day of my second year of law school because I had been denied bail after being arrested. And I was older than a lot of my fellow students. So I certainly brought a different perspective. At times that made me feel a little bit lonely. But at other times, I think it was actually helpful to some of my fellow students who thought, wow, there isn't only one way of becoming a lawyer.
That is just an absolutely incredible story. I just love that. All right, so I want to talk about the book, which is, and I just want to say I have some firsthand experience with how the law is not all it's cracked up to be, as I went through my divorce and saw firsthand how it is weaponized and used. The system is so broken against women. But the focus here is obviously intimate partner violence, and the title of the book, "And Sometimes They Kill You." That's pretty arresting. It stops you in your tracks. So why did you choose that title?
I chose that title because when I heard that quote, and I'll explain the circumstances in a second, I was arrested and stopped in my tracks. And sometimes they kill you. It's blunt, but it's real. Sometimes they do kill you. In the spring of 2022, I was in Renfrew County preparing for what's been called the CKW inquest, an inquest into the murders of 3 women by the same man who had had intimate involvements with each of them. Before the inquest began, I was holding consultations throughout the community. So Renfrew County is a very large, geographically large county with a very small population. And I had been hired by the women's community to consult with members of the community to find out what would they like the inquest to know about the impact of those murders on them as members of the community. At one of them, one of the participants was a young woman who led a girls' empowerment group in a very small village, really, in Renfrew County. And she described the first time that girls' empowerment group came together after the murders. The murders had taken place in September of 2015. And they were talking about things like being safe and what's a healthy relationship, how do people handle conflict and in a healthy way, and so on. And one girl who the group leader said was probably around 12 years old said, "Yeah, I know. Sometimes they fight with you and sometimes they kill you." And it just chilled me in that moment. Mm-hmm. I've never forgotten it. As I started to write the book, I thought, that's what I want to lead with. I want it to be dramatic. I want it to draw people's attention to the cover of the book because I want them to read it. But I don't think it's a sensationalistic title because it's the truth. The rate of violence against women is terribly high. It got much higher during the pandemic. It hasn't gone down. The rate at which women are killed is appalling in a country that claims women have equality with men. And so to start out by just saying, this is what can happen, basically, they can kill you. They can kill you because we let them.
So, which leads me to my next question. Why does IPV remain so pervasive? And what societal factors are contributing to this crisis?
Well, that's a $64,000 question in a way. In another way, it's the loony question, because I think the answer in some ways is quite simple. And I'll give it to you in a minute. What's more complicated is why we're not paying attention to that answer, right? Intimate partner violence continues because we let it continue. We let it continue because despite the many advances that women in Canada have seen, we remain unequal. We continue to live in a culture that is highly misogynist. At one end of the spectrum, people can make really offensive sexist and misogynist jokes that just get allowed to go by in a way that nobody could make a racist joke anymore. Somehow it's considered rude or bitchy to interrupt at a dinner party or a social gathering when somebody says something flippant and disrespectful about women. So the presence of misogyny is why we continue to see such high rates of intimate partner violence. And part of what happens with misogyny is that women's equality remains in place. So women still don't earn as much money as men. During the pandemic, women's economic security took an enormous hit. We were all locked in at home with our partners, some of whom were abusive. Our children were at home. We were trying to keep our jobs and oversee our children going to school. I said to my adult children more than once, it's a good thing you were grown up before the pandemic, because I wouldn't have functioned well in that setting, trying to manage all of those things. So women, were pushed back a whole lot because of the pandemic. Not that it was that great before. And that's ground that has yet to be made back up. So misogyny, women's ongoing economic and social and political inequality. But there's another reason. And I think it's this. There's nobody who does not know somebody who's being abused or who is causing that harm, even if people don't know it. So it's so close to home that I think it's just too scary for some people to be willing to admit to how serious the problem is and to take the steps that are needed to end it. You know, we do move forward. I think one of the best outcomes of the CKW inquest was the very first recommendation that the jury made to declare intimate partner violence to be an epidemic. Now, that recommendation was made to the provincial government. It has not taken that step, but more than 100 communities in Ontario, from the smallest town or village to the largest city in Ontario, Toronto, have passed those resolutions. And public awareness is growing very slowly, but that's the only way we're going to stop this from happening, is when we have a public that says we refuse. We refuse to have communities that are not safe for everyone who lives in them, including women and children.
Throughout the book, you share stories of survivors and victims, including obviously the systemic failures that contributed to their suffering. And aside from that very first case, obviously, that has stuck with you forever, has there been a particular story that has really stayed with you and profoundly impacted how you approach your work?
I'm going to answer that question a little bit differently. I hold in my head and in my heart 2 or 3 women who I represented when I was practicing law, who I've always thought would end up being killed by their partner. I don't know if they have been or they haven't been. People change their last names. They move to different parts of the country or even leave the country. But I would say, rather than having one story that drives my work, it's the memories of these 2 or 3 women and never knowing what happened to them. I mean, as I say in the book, at the end of the book, that first client, who I call Susanna, that's not her name, obviously, she'd be a middle-aged woman by now. Her kids would be adults. And I do often think, what happened for those children? Were they able to grow up away from abuse? How affected were they by what had happened before Susanna was able to get away from her husband? Were they able to enter into relationships that are healthy as opposed to abusive? But the ones, there's these 2 or 3 women where if I can't sleep, their faces sort of pan across my eyes and I think, whatever happened there?
Have you ever tried to seek them out?
Nope. No, I don't, because a lawyer-client relationship is a very one-way street in a certain way. They came to me for help at a particular time in their lives, and it's up to them whether they want to maintain that connection. I do have maybe 3 or 4 clients who I hear from every now and then. I'll get a Christmas card or a picture of a kid when they graduate from high school or something like that. And actually, it's been interesting since I wrote the book, and I've been traveling around Ontario promoting the book. At 2 or 3 events, women have come up to me quietly at the end and said, "You probably don't remember me, but you were my lawyer," or "I called you up once, and the advice you gave me was really helpful." That's incredibly powerful for me. Very validating.
What do you see as the most urgent legal reforms needed to protect survivors and then also prevent future violence?
In the area of family law, I think that the law across Canada generally, and even more so in some provinces, including Ontario, is in pretty good shape right now because of major changes that were made just a few years ago. But what we need to do is see that improved law implemented well, and that requires judicial education. This is always a challenge. I think that we're on a hopeful path there, largely because of the work of an amazing woman, Jennifer Kagan, whose daughter Kira was killed by her father in 2020, February of 2020. And Jennifer has worked tirelessly to call for judicial education for family law judges in particular. And we're starting to see some response to that work of hers. So that's not really law reform, but it's reform to how the law is implemented. I think we need judges who understand profoundly that not all abuse is physical, that all abuse, whether the children are in the room or not in the room, whether they hear it or they don't hear it, that all abuse affects children in a significant way. That a man who's prepared to be abusive to his partner is not necessarily a physical threat to his children, but that parenting arrangements have to reflect the fact that their mother doesn't feel safe around him, and so on. So I think that's a huge area for us to be working on. Criminal law is a whole different kettle of fish. Only 20 to 30% of women report intimate partner violence to the police. So there's a whole huge amount of this abuse that never finds its way into the criminal law because it has such a poor response. So right now in Canada, there are mandatory charging directives in place that leave it up to the police to decide whether or not to lay a charge. This takes a lot of autonomy away from the survivor and hasn't always been helpful to women. Sometimes their situation is made worse if the partner is charged. I think we need to look at those policies. But bigger picture than that, I think we should be looking at whether the criminal law as it now exists is the best way to deal with these cases. Or should we be looking at something like restorative justice or transformative justice? Because surely, ultimately, our goal is to stop it from happening, not just to punish somebody for having done it. When we look at these cases, not that I'm excusing the behavior in any way at all, but we often see that those who are the causers of harm have their own histories of having been abused or having been exposed to abuse when they were children. So we need to find an earlier entry point and find a way to restore both the survivor and the causer of harm to healthy places. And I don't think the criminal law, the way it functions right now, does that.
This episode is brought to you by Pluto TV. Pluto TV has all the shows and movies you love streaming for free. That means laughter is free with gut-busting comedies like The Neighborhood, Key and Peele, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Mystery is free with countless cases to crack from Criminal Minds, Tracker, and Matlock. And thrills are free with heart-pumping hits like The Walking Dead and Defiance. Feel the free. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.
This episode is brought to you by the Toyota Grand Highlander. From daily routines to life-changing adventures, the Toyota Grand Highlander is spacious, powerful, and ready to take on life's grand challenges. Advanced safety features and innovative technology give you confidence for whatever life throws at you. And it's available in a hybrid Nightshade Special Edition, which includes sophisticated gloss black exterior accents and 20-inch black alloy wheels. Learn more at toyota.com/Grand Highlander. Toyota, let's go places.
I think one of the most frustrating things for me going through the family law process was how the system actually enabled the abuse, because there were consequences that were handed down by a judge, but never any response. Nobody ever did anything about it. It would be months and months and months. So I would be saying, like, he's bleeding me dry. He's spending all of our joint income here. And so he was able to do that to the point where I was left $250,000 in debt when it was all said and done.
That's a huge problem. We call it litigation abuse or legal bullying. It can take a whole lot of forms. The economic kinds of problems that you're talking about are significant. But there's other ways that it can happen too. A family law proceeding can drag on for so long that not only does the woman run out of economic resources, she's spent emotionally. She's got nothing more to give, because where there's been a history of abuse, she's living in fear through that whole time. If he represents himself, he's got ready access to her. He doesn't have a lawyer who can say, hey, bud, settle down here. That behavior is not going to be helpful to you in the courtroom. He can turn the children against her. There are so many ways that the process itself, as you say, is or can be enabling to an abuser. We need to find ways to make these cases move through the courts more quickly. We need to make sure that everybody can have a lawyer, regardless of their financial situation. And I think, to go back to my point about judicial education, if judges were better educated about the dynamics of abuse and the reality that just because two people split up, it doesn't mean the abuse ended. In fact, it generally escalates for a period of time after separation. If judges were better educated, they would be able to help these cases move along in a more efficient manner.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm just, I mean, I know we're talking about intimate-partner violence, but because we got onto family law, I think I'm off on this whole other track now, thinking about how my experience with it, which was so that I felt that there was the bark but no bite. And
there's very little follow through.
Yeah, and this really unofficial sort of handbook that is handed around. This is how you do it. So like he suddenly decided he was going to self-represent, which brought a whole, so I'm paying lawyers' fees. He's not. And he's getting all the concessions for this.
When somebody self-represents, they do get a lot of concessions because, and I understand how difficult it is for a judge. They tend to bend over backwards because they don't want a complaint later that the self-represented individual didn't understand the law properly. I get that. On the other hand, sometimes it's obvious that the person is representing themselves in order to try to hold on to more power in the courtroom, in order to be able to cross-examine their former partner directly rather than having that cross-examination conducted by a lawyer, that kind of thing. And that's highly problematic. Family court is seen, I think, by those who work within it as a friendlier system than the criminal law. I've got no problems with things being friendly. But that doesn't mean they can't have teeth. It doesn't mean that the people involved in the case shouldn't have to be accountable to one another and to what the court has said. I worked with so many women who would get a sort of decent order, but then the abusive ex wouldn't follow it. And their attempts to have any steps taken to hold him accountable for that, whether it was around not paying child support, not providing proper financial statements so the property could be divided, or withholding the children from her, it's very difficult to get any meaningful responses to that. And so then women throw up their hands and they're like, well, why did I even bother to go to court? I'm just going to manage this on my own. That should never happen. But when the former partner who's ignoring the orders is an abuser, when a woman throws up her hands like that, she and the children end up at greater risk than they should be. So terrible for anybody, but possibly lethal for someone whose partner is looking to continue to maintain power and control.
Right back to the title, and sometimes they kill us. So the book opens with a deep dive into inquests and inquiries. Obviously, you've mentioned the Renfrew County triple femicide. There was the Nova Scotia mass shooting. What did these processes reveal about how Canada handles IPV cases, and what lessons can we take from those?
I think both the CKW inquest in Ontario and the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission offer us some very important reflections, lessons, and also suggestions for where we need to go. What we can see from both of those inquiries is that the presence of intimate partner violence is often ignored until something escalates to an explosive level. In Renfrew County, that was the murders of 3 women in the space of about an hour by one person who felt that it was legitimate for him to do that because, in his opinion, they had all discarded him in one way or another. In Nova Scotia, it was a much bigger response in as much as the perpetrator there didn't, in fact, kill the intimate partner he had been abusing for 19 years, but went out into the community and killed many, many people. But in both cases, those ultimate killings can be traced back to intimate partner violence and more general gender-based violence. What we can learn is that until we change the systems, we're not going to eradicate this kind of violence. I mean, those were 2 events that garnered a great deal of public attention. The media covered them well and in detail and continue to report on them, which I think is a major step forward. The recommendations, we need to pay attention to them. in particular, I think we need to pay attention, and they're similar. There's a lot of overlap in the recommendations between those two events. I think we need to focus on certain of the hundreds of recommendations that are there. We need to admit that this is a society-wide problem that requires a society-wide response. We can't silo it and say, well, we need the Minister of Education to do this, and we need somebody over here to do that. No, it needs to involve all of us. It needs to involve all governments and all parts of government in a coordinated response, because sometimes one response over here and one over there end up conflicting with one another, or at least not helping one another. So that whole idea of a society-wide response, I think, is critical. If I could only pick one other theme that I think is really important, our governments need to be accountable and transparent to us. So one of the things about having been part of the inquest in Ontario, and now I sit on Ontario's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, where we also make recommendations for system change based on our reviews of domestic violence homicides. One of the things that's really frustrating is that there's no law that says those recommendations have to be implemented. So whether it's the jury at the inquest, and in this case, they spent 3 weeks listening to dozens of witnesses, reading hundreds of pages of evidence, and then worked very hard to write 86 extremely thoughtful recommendations, or whether it's the work of death review committees, which exist in many provinces, where the members look at the details of individual homicides of women and come up with recommendations for change. Why are we doing that work if there's nobody who has to implement the recommendations, or where there's no system to track them, no official system to track them and say, hey, this recommendation's been made in 7 provinces. It's been made 27 times in the last 20 years. Let's move ahead. So I think that whole idea of accountability and transparency, coupled with we need a system-wide response, to me are the biggest takeaways, not just from these 2 events, the inquest in Ontario and the Mass Casualty Commission, but the work of many, many inquests, inquiries, and death review committees right across Canada.
I think right now, too, especially we're obviously living in this really polarized environment. Even when it comes to men versus women, it seems it's becoming, women are just digging in and sort of decentering men from the conversation. There's this whole new sort of pushback happening. And so, which creates, I think, a very tense environment. So how do we bring men into this conversation to involve them in preventing violence and changing harmful behaviors, especially given that it is, I think, more polarized than it's ever been?
The first part of what I want to say is we absolutely have to do that. I am old enough that when I first started doing this work, before I was a lawyer, I fervently believed that women had to do the work, because to allow men to be part of the work was going to mean we had to fight for our space in the work. And I think that was true then. I think it could still be true now. I think it was very important for the women's movement to develop as exactly that, a movement of women saying, we're taking control, we're taking charge. We have lived experience, many of us, with this kind of gender-based violence. And so we're going to sort of set the terms of the conversation, if you will. And that's why events like Take Back the Night have typically been for women only, or women and children only, with men encouraged to attend and support on the sidelines. I think that was a very important period of time to go through. We now have to find ways to work together where men who come into doing the work understand they're not being invited in to take over, that we know a lot, but we're asking them to join us. I often think of it like this: the majority of men do not abuse their partners. Many of those men think that's all they need to do to not be part of the problem or to be part of the solution. Well, I don't abuse my wife. Great. Thanks. You shouldn't even have to say that, because that should be our starting point. Now, what are you going to do about that? It doesn't mean that you're going to be the next head of an organization, but what do you do about that within your own family when your brother makes a sexist joke, or when you see something that's abusive happening in your family, in your community, in your neighborhood, in your workplace? Let's start out there. How do we help men understand that they have a role to play in speaking up on that kind of individual level? But then when we talk about system level change, so for instance, let's say we're going to have a conversation about maybe we should get rid of mandatory charging directives. We need to have men at those tables, men who have never been abusive, men who have engaged in abusive behavior, because I want to know, how did that affect you? Was that helpful to you that you got charged there? Or was there a different kind of wake-up call that might have been more helpful to you? And obviously there will be men there because of their jobs, right? There may be men at that table who are police officers or crown attorneys or judges. But I think for me, what I'm the most interested in is engaging that block of men who are not abusive, but who don't think they need to do anything more than that. So that requires a bit of an opening up on the part of some of us women who have seen this as our terrain. But it also requires an opening up on the part of men, good men, to understand that simply not abusing your partner is not the end of what you need to do to fix this problem. Boys and girls need to see not just men who aren't abusive, but men who are actively calling out sexism, unfair rules, unfair laws, making sure that their girls' soccer team has as much funding as the boys' soccer team, whatever it might be. There's lots of room for lots of different voices in this work.
I don't think anybody, well, certainly nobody listening to this show will dispute what's happening. I've talked about intimate partner violence a lot on what she said. But I think where women get stuck is where can we put our efforts that it's going to, affect the most change. We see stores who, you can buy things and money goes to and all things like that. Where would you say people should focus their efforts, though, to combat intimate partner violence?
I don't think there's one place for people to focus their efforts. I think it really depends on who the person is and what they think they're bringing to the conversation. So for some people, that's going to be money, and money is always needed. Shelters need money. All kinds of organizations need money. And I don't ever want people who say, well, all I do is give money, to feel like that's not a really important part of supporting the work. But I also like to encourage people to think about stepping outside their comfort zone and trying something that they might think they can't do or that they're too afraid to do. And even there's such a host of things people can do. Somebody could write a letter to the editor of their local newspaper saying, hey, our town has declared intimate partner violence to be an epidemic. So what's our next step going to be? Somebody could write something a bit longer, more like an op-ed to a bigger newspaper, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Ottawa Citizen, saying the same thing, but expanding on that question a little more deeply. It's always helpful if somebody knows they want to do something and they don't know where to start, to get in touch with a women's organization in their community. Find out what's happening. Is there a law reform effort underway that a person could become involved with? Somebody who's a good writer, a good editor, a good speaker. Those people are always needed. There's always a place for those folks, but there's also a lot of room for people who want to be in the background, setting up a telephone tree, organizing people to come to meetings. And as important as all of that work, the sort of system level work, we need people to become educated so we know how to notice where there might be abuse happening. Now, I always find this is a bit tricky to talk about because I don't want people listening to me talk and thinking, okay, so I should be peering through the windows of my neighbor's house, or I should be, really getting nosy. I'm not talking about that, but there are some good tools, and I really recommend the program called Neighbors, Friends, and Families out of Western University, which has some really great materials on what are some signs of abuse? What are some red flags that someone you know might be in a relationship where they're being abused? Become familiar with those signs and red flags so that if your colleague at work is consistently coming in with injuries that she can't explain, or is missing a lot of work and isn't really giving a good reason for why that's happening. There's lots of other red flags. I don't have time to go into all of them here. Just become aware of what those are so that you can start a very delicate, respectful conversation. Is everything okay? I'm worried because I've seen this. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. If you want to know about some resources, I've got those. And that's the other thing. If we're going to start paying attention and trying to find ways to support individuals in our community, we need to make sure we know what the resources in our community are. Because the last thing you want is to be in a situation where somebody opens up to you and says, what should I do? And you say, I don't know, I'll find out and get back to you. So I think finding ways to talk with somebody who we're worried about, finding ways to make conversations about intimate partner violence normal, things we can talk about at the neighborhood barbecue in July. Have you ever thought about this? Maybe we should read this book. I think book clubs are a great place to start some of these conversations, frankly. In our churches, in our religious institutions, at our family get-togethers. We like to talk about all kinds of politics, but we don't very often like to talk about this. Let's normalize it.
Great point. I agree with you. And just, it's like a lot of conversations, that we're having anymore. I'm just sort of, it's not the same, but we talk about alcohol much more openly now and how, and matter of factly. And so these conversations about intimate partner violence should be able to be just discussed in the same way without that sort of shame or stigma attached to having that conversation.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up alcohol because I'm 70. When I was 18, we drove when we were intoxicated. I think there's a statute of limitations. I don't think I'm bring up any potential charges, but we drove when we'd had too much to drink without even thinking about it. And by the time my kids were of drinking age, they wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car if they'd had a glass of wine. So in essentially one generation, of course, there's still drunk drivers, but we all but eradicated that problem. So we have to find ways at coming at this issue of violence within families so we can do the same thing. I don't want to think that my grandsons, who are adolescent age to young men now, are still going to be living in a world where, their children are dealing with this problem. It's been here since the beginning of time. I don't like to think it's going to be with us until the end of time. I think we're smarter than that. We need to be smarter than that.
I have one last question for you, and this might give some hope to somebody who's just entering, this battle. You've been doing this for decades. What would you tell your younger self when you first stepped into the trenches of this fight?
Oh, that's a great question. And I've thought about it sometimes because often I think, if only I'd started doing this work earlier when I was younger, I could have got so much more done. But I also know that if I'd done it earlier, I wouldn't have done it as smart. I wouldn't have got a lot of what I needed to get in order to do it well. So it's never too early. It's never too late. I do have a huge amount of hope. People have often said to me over the years, oh, you must just be so sad or so angry all the time. I am sad some of the time. I am angry some of the time. But I'm also hopeful because honestly, if I wasn't hopeful, I wouldn't even try to make changes. And over the years that I've done this work, I've met some of the most courageous women, some of the smartest women. We have made changes. At times they seem so small as to be inconsequential. But then when you look back and you think, okay, that small improvement led to this next one, and now look where we are. Who would have ever thought that 100 communities in Ontario would declare intimate partner violence to be an epidemic? I wouldn't have thought that 3 years ago, but it's happened. And I spent a lot of my time traveling through those communities, speaking with community groups. People want to make a difference. They want to be involved in creating safe communities. That wasn't true 5 years ago, in my opinion. So I do feel like we're on a steady path, and there's room for everybody to be part of the work to continue taking us down that path. We're learning all the time. Strategies that worked 10 years ago don't work now. We have different ideas about the change we want to make. The more voices who are part of those conversations, the better the outcome is going to be.
I can't thank you enough for joining me today. This was really enlightening. A lot of great information that you shared. Can people get in touch with you? Where can they find your book? What's the best place for them to learn more?
They can find lots of things out at my website, pamelacross.ca. The book, they can find how to buy the book there. They can also go to their local independent bookstore. If it's not in stock, the bookstore will order it, or they can contact the publisher through its website, Between the Lines, and buy the book online. So the best way to reach me is through my website. And the book, I would say, start with your local independent bookstore. And if that doesn't work out for you, head to Between the Lines Publishing.
And are you anywhere on social media?
That's an interesting question. Because I just decided this morning to get off Twitter because I'm so angry.
That's a toxic place.
It's not even that. I don't want to have anything to do with Elon Musk. So I probably won't be on social media for very long.
Excellent. All right. Well, people can find you on your website then.
They can.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Pamela.
Thank you, Candace.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to share it with someone who'd love it too. And don't forget to hit subscribe to What She Said with me, Candace Sampson, on your favorite podcast app. It's the easiest way to stay connected. Want more? Sign up for my newsletter at whatshesaidtalk.com to get all the latest updates, and let's keep the conversation going on social. You can find What She Said on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll find me on Threads, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Candace Said. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Are your poor communication skills holding you back from being the leader you know you can be? The Master Communicator is a podcast that can help you improve your communication skills in just a few minutes a week. I'm David Tyler, a broadcaster and communication coach, and each week I deliver bite-sized masterclasses for busy leaders like you. Each episode is packed with practical techniques and strategies to help you navigate challenging conversations, delivering impactful messages, and inspire your team. Whether you're looking to enhance your executive presence, build a culture of trust, or simply lead with more confidence, the Master Communicator is your go-to resource. Subscribe now and start your journey to becoming the leader you were meant to be. Transform your communication skills, one episode at a time.
Hi, it's Ashley and Jess with Wellness Reality Check. We are two health practitioners, moms, and best friends trying to navigate the world of holistic health in a balanced, productive way that brings health to our lives instead of dogmatic extremes. We'll be breaking down health trends, interviewing your favorite health influencers, and always keeping it real. We hope this podcast brings listeners back down to earth, providing a dose of reality in the often idealized world of health and wellness.
Wellness Reality Check. Follow the show now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or at wellnessrealitycheck.com.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.